Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our session on the second panel on cost-effectiveness analysis. I'm Peter Newman from Tufts Medical Center. Really delighted to see all of you here. And we have a great panel. I'll introduce them in a moment. Just a few brief introductory slides from me, and then we'll get right into it. We had, 20 years ago, the original panel on cost-effectiveness. Some people have called this the Gold Book. The first author is Martha Gold. The color is gold, and it's the gold standard. So it's called the Gold Book. They had many recommendations, a reference case for cost-effectiveness analyses, standard set of practices that analysts should adhere to. Emphasis on cost per qualities became a standard reference. But a lot has happened since then. Policy-wise, we've had the WHO choice, we've had NICE, we've had ICWIG, we've had policies in the US. IOM calls for cost per qualities. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or CDC, calls for CEA. ACA prohibits cost per qualities. Gates reference case. There are many, many other things happening on the policy side, on the method side. It was time for a second panel. It was felt. And so here's the second panel. I was very pleased to co-chair it with my colleague Jillian Sanders and some of the people who are here today from as well, some of whom are here. These are people selected because of their backgrounds, diversity in terms of disciplines and some geographic background. 3 international members, 2 from Canada, 1 from the UK. Our process, planning began in 2011, panel selected in 2012, first teleconference 2013. After that, we had every 6 weeks teleconference. Many emails, chapters sort of met very, very frequently, but the whole panel every 6 weeks met by teleconference. We also had a series of in-person meetings. We met in Baltimore. We met in Bethesda. We almost came to blows in Miami. No, I'm kidding. These were intense meetings. We met in Seattle, 2 to 3 day meetings. Reviewed the entire first panel, lots of issues on the table. We then sent out the chapters for review. And then we had a final meeting in Boston and came out with a paper in JAMA and our book. Funding generously provided by RWJ and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Very grateful to them. AHRQ with a conference grant and SMDM. Objectives were similar to the first panel. Review the state of the field and provide recommendations to improve the quality and comparability of cost-effectiveness analysis. Intended audiences, similar to the first panel. Certainly policymakers, payers, researchers, but also we thought would have some resonance and interest in the clinical community, among patients, others, students, administrators, guideline writers, others who think about resource allocation. Many considerations, just to give you a little flavor and think about this as you hear the next speakers, how closely to adhere to the original panel. Somebody said recently to me, they had the second book and the first book, and they said, Old Testament, New Testament. I said, that's clearly not the way I would put it. But there was a sense that the first panel really raised the bar. If it wasn't sacred text, we certainly looked very carefully at what the first panel said. On the other hand, we brought our own judgments, sensibilities, opinions, viewpoints. And as we mentioned, a lot has happened since 20 years ago. So there was a lot to update and think about. How much theory, how much pragmatism? Do we want to adhere to underlying principles of welfare economics? To what extent? How much do we want to give a nod to practical concerns? How prescriptive? Certainly it's important and it's good to give guidance and people want guidance. On the other hand, there's a danger of being overly prescriptive. You want to preserve some flexibility for practitioners. Analyst burden, certainly on our minds. International versus U.S. This is a U.S.-focused book, mostly U.S. Authors, though we hope this book, as the first panel did, has resonance overseas. We certainly learned a lot from lessons in the UK and Canada and Australia and Western Europe and elsewhere. We have 3 international or non-U.S. members, as I mentioned, who brought a lot of their own experiences and helped a lot as we thought about these issues. Importantly, we had external review. We have 13 chapters and then 2 appendix chapters. We asked 45 people formally to review the chapters, 3 or 4 per chapter. A lot of good comments, and we revised based on them. We also posted the chapters for public comment in the fall of 2015. We had a lot of good comments. Maybe some of you contributed comments, and if you did, we are grateful to you. We also had a great technical editor. I want to acknowledge Rebecca Gray, who helped editing. So finally, I mentioned the paper in JAMA, the summary paper last September, and the book, which undoubtedly you all have a copy of by now. I don't see anybody disagreeing with that, but just to orient you as we go into these talks, 14 chapters, 13 in the appendix chapters, using cost effectiveness, history, definitions, foundation, then theoretical foundations. We have a lot to say about the reference case. We have a whole chapter on it. You'll hear about it. Designing a cost effectiveness analysis, a whole chapter on modeling, a whole chapter on estimating consequences and how one might think about that with all the ramifications. Valuing health outcomes, costs. Chapter 9, evidence synthesis. Discounting. Uncertainty, ethical considerations, and reporting. So you see lots and lots of topics. I mentioned in the appendix we have 2 worked examples, one by my colleague David Kim, who will be presenting today, where we go through all the recommendations of the panel and play it out in real examples. 4 of these chapters are completely new. That is, they didn't appear in the first book. Chapter 3, reference case. Chapter 5, modeling. Chapter 9, evidence synthesis. Chapter 12, ethical considerations. Certainly there was material on these topics in the first book, but we felt, given growth in the fields, these topics warranted their own chapters. All the other chapters are extensively rewritten and updated. So finally, let me just highlight 3 recommendations, and you'll hear a lot more about these from the subsequent speakers. First of all, we, said the second panel, recommend 2 reference cases. We recommend that analysts conduct a reference case from the healthcare sector, a more narrow reference case, and from a societal perspective, considering elements that would not be captured in the health sector. We recommend cost per qualities, and you'll hear much more about this. And the rationale is the health sector is closer to what payers, decision makers, health system officials seem to want and seem to have been doing over the years. On the other hand, there may well be, and probably are, in many cases, important elements being left out, and it's important to know the consequences, the costs, the benefits, wherever they fall. Secondly, we recommend an impact inventory, a checklist of items that we recommend that analysts should include, with a lot more clarity in the future, we hope, about what's being included. You'll hear more about this. And finally, a series of other recommendations on productivity, on future costs, on reporting, and on some other items. So with that, let me say thank you again for coming, and I will introduce the panel. I won't go through their bios. They're all extraordinarily accomplished people. David Meltzer, physician health economist, professor at the University of Chicago. Josh Solomon, health economist at Harvard University. And maybe, Josh, you'll tell us where you're going next. Lisa Prosser, health economist, professor at the University of Michigan. And finally, my colleague, David Kim, a health economist, assistant professor at Tufts Medical Center. So with that, thank you again for coming, and I will turn it over to David. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. That was great. And I just want to say it was really a wonderful group to work with. But Peter and Jillian really led the organization of all of us, and we weren't always easy to organize. So they did a great job. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical foundations chapter and also some of the issues around costs. So I want to try to give you a little bit of the flavor of some of the tensions that we were all talking through as we worked on this. And some of the key issues around the role of theory versus the pressures behind practical decision making. And let me just say that there were some things we clearly agreed on, like that cost effectiveness was widely used, that its goal overall is to maximize desired outcomes, that result from decisions subject to certain constraints. And we all agreed that we wanted this tool to be able to be usable in a lot of different contexts, whether medical, public health, or looking at non-health spending, or even tools like allocating money for research, where areas like value of information analysis had become important. We also recognized and agreed that there were a variety of conventions that were commonly used, like the use of QALYs. There were variations around those, for example, how to measure quality of life. And then there were sort of persistent controversies, like distributional issues about how to think what outcomes to measure. And we realized that we weren't going to solve all of these. We also recognized that there was an incredible diversity in people's beliefs about which costs to consider. And these were often tied to variation in perspective of a very practical nature. Cost effectiveness analysis was intended to be a tool actually be used, and because people differed in what they thought, it would only make sense if they were trying to maximize outcomes subject to constraint, that they're going to differ in what costs they want to consider. That said, we thought theory really mattered, and that the theoretical foundations in this field were diverse, from economics, psychology, ethics, and that they were important in informing these choices. And we all identified that there were examples of areas where theory had really informed progress over the time since the last report, areas like the measurement of net health benefits, future costs, and value of information analysis. So the theoretical foundations chapter is certainly heavy on economic and other theories. But there were a whole series of other concerns that came up and often conflicted with each other as we thought about recommendations. So one concern was this idea that we really wanted to align the analyses with their purpose. And what this suggested is that we needed flexibility for decision makers to assess costs and benefits as relevant to their particular context. And so this led to recommendations about an impact table, which you'll hear about from Josh in a moment. And it really is perhaps the single most important recommendation, I think, that came out of this. Another key concern that I, for one, did not appreciate when I started on the panel was the importance of comparability across analyses. Now, it wasn't that I wasn't aware that comparability was important, but what I didn't realize is that comparability, as opposed to alignment with purpose, was really the motivation originally for the reference case. We shouldn't think of one reference case or the other as right, but think of them as standard examples which allow you to figure out whether, if the results of two analyses differ, it's because of different assumptions or different data and goals. So in other words, you don't want to have some assumption about a discount rate, for example, cause one analysis to differ from another and not understand that that's what's causing it. And the reference case sort of helps you do that. As a result, we ended up with two reference points, the societal reference point and the healthcare sector. And we chose them, one, because they're both commonly valued, albeit for different purposes. The societal one because of its connection, at least hopefully, to some level of economic theory, and the healthcare sector because of its relevance to payers and its common use. The other critical tension was the desire to minimize practitioner burden, because we realized that if we suggested two reference cases and an impact table, that was going to be a lot of work. And so we spent a lot of time fighting over essentially these issues, mainly because we were concerned about suggesting that so many different approaches be used. Let me focus on the societal reference case, because I think that's where the theoretical foundations issues played out most. I think most of the conclusions of this are fairly similar to the previous panels, that a societal reference case should include medical costs, although we added in not just current but also future related and unrelated costs borne by third-party payers and paid for out of pocket by patients, time costs of patients in seeking and receiving care, the time cost of informal unpaid care by caregivers, transportation costs, effects on future productivity and consumption, again, new since the previous panel, which had been ambiguous about that, and then other costs and effects outside the healthcare sector, and I'll come back to this in a minute. One of the key principles was this idea that when thinking about a societal perspective, an intervention, that A on the left of the slide, leads to a bunch of consequences. And we want to measure all those consequences once and only once. And the question really is, do you put them in the denominator or do you put them in the numerator? And so on the top, you'll see the things going in the numerator on the cost side, use of healthcare resources, non-healthcare resources, time of caregivers, of patients, and then productivity effects. And then the denominator, the incremental health effects. And that was the way we thought of dividing it up. But the key underlying principle was count everything once and only once. And in fact, a lot of the disagreements where they exist in the literature is about whether, for example, health status measures were really affecting productivity or measuring productivity, for example. So let me just focus on 3 topics that were particularly important for costs: time costs, productivity costs, and future costs. So for time costs, our recommendation was that the time costs for patients and caregivers are real changes to the use of resources by both patients and society, so they should be measured, and that aligned with the first panel's recommendation. We did not recommend any inclusion of adjustment for the pleasantness or unpleasantness of activities during those times, although there was a lot of discussion of it. We also recommend that time spent seeking health care be measured and valued as it is thought to come from one's leisure time, and this was to be valued at the marginal post-tax wage plus fringe benefits, so the sort of social opportunity cost, and then the same really for time spent by caregivers in providing care to patients, which otherwise could have been a productive activity. Productivity costs were included and recommended to reflect the lost production value due to a patient's health status. The assumption was that these needed to be measured explicitly and that they were not subsumed within quality measurements, and this deviates from the first panel's recommendations, where there was a lot of language suggesting that they'd been reflected somehow in these, but we didn't think that the literature supported that. We noted 3 types of productive time: time spent in formal labor markets, time spent in informal labor markets, and time spent in household production. And in all these cases, productive time was again valued using the pre-tax wage plus fringe benefits. There were some obvious distributional issues that came up in thinking about this. So whose wage to use? Should they be age and gender specific? That was the first panel's recommendation. Should they be age specific? Should you use median wages across all age, gender, race groups, and so on? In the end, we really didn't add any new recommendations to this. I think from the old one, we left it, if anything, more open to the analyst. Finally, around future costs, we recommended that all healthcare costs, related or unrelated, should be considered either when survival under the alternative interventions differ or when cost components cannot be identified as just only related to the target condition. So in general, the recommendation is that these future costs, both healthcare and productivity related, should be included. In the societal perspective was where the sort of non-healthcare costs should be included, and there the total cost should be healthcare costs plus non-healthcare costs minus productivity, and it was recommended that all these be included. There are a couple of areas of ongoing controversy where we just sort of noted them and didn't decide to make strong recommendations. One was about how to value non-health effects of policy. So we recommended that they be valued, so things like educational attainment, crime, other social outcomes, but we recognized that there were not established methods for doing it, and so particularly in the impact inventory, we recommended that the analyst at least describe these effects and take some defensible approach that they would explain as to how to value them. There was also concern about valuing these in the context of the budgets of non-health parts of government. In other words, for example, if there was a harm to educational attainment, but the education budget was highly constrained so that they couldn't be compensated for by spending, there could be a greater opportunity cost in that budget than in some other budget. And that was a concern which we noted, but again, didn't know how to solve. And then finally, a whole series of issues on how to evaluate effects on others, whether those are within the family, so utility effects on others and altruistic sort of effects, or outside the family and broader distributional effects were all noted as concerns that were important, but about which we really couldn't add to the literature in suggesting how an analyst should address them. So with that, let me turn things over to Josh.
Thank you, David, and thanks to you all for your interest in the session this afternoon. I like how David says very casually, there's a couple of areas of ongoing controversy. We'll see how that is borne out when we get to the discussion area. But I want to elaborate on a couple of the key recommendations that you've already heard a little bit about and start to flesh those out just a bit more. And that process will actually continue when I pass over to Lisa and then to David. And these two recommendations refer to the reference cases that you've already heard mentioned a couple of times, and the impact inventory is one of the novel contributions of the second panel. So let me start by reminding you all about the original panel's recommendations in these two regards. So the original panel, as you all know, introduced this idea of a reference case as a standard set of methods for cost-effectiveness analyses that all analysts may want to follow in order to improve the comparability and the quality of their analyses. As you all know, the original panel did choose the societal perspective and really intended that to reflect the viewpoint of a decision maker considering the broad allocation of resources across the entire population, with the rationale for this choice being that it represents the public interest rather than that of any particular group, and considers all parties affected by an intervention or policy choice, and further accounts all significant outcomes and costs that follow from some decision or choice, regardless of who experiences those outcomes or costs. At the same time, the original panel also did recognize that specific decision makers, whether those are insurers or health plans or Medicare, might want to use their own perspective. And so that is a possible addition to this societal perspective in the reference case for comparability. Now, since the publication of the original panel's recommendation, we observed that very few analyses have actually ended up taking the societal perspective. Even some analyses, many analyses that purported to do so, in fact, have, when you actually read carefully the studies, taken a narrower perspective than a societal one. So omitting time costs frequently, and certainly consequences outside of the healthcare sector omitted almost always. Moreover, since the original panel, there's been a number of decision-making bodies in Europe and Australia and elsewhere who've developed formal guidance for conducting cost-effectiveness analyses in public policies and generally have not recommended the use of a societal perspective for these. So that's the backdrop against which we wrestled and really kind of wrestled a lot with the range of different possible outcomes or options for defining the perspective of the analysis. So on the one hand, we recognized the persistent appeal of the societal perspective, capturing all of the consequences of a choice, reflecting the broad public interest. On the other hand, we were aware of the risk in ignoring the revealed preference of practitioners and policymakers over the last 20 years who evidently have demanded information that in many cases reflects a narrower perspective. We acknowledge the difficulty in identifying a single societal perspective, recognizing that there are subtle but important choices about what elements are included in that and how we might value those. We considered a range of options that ranged from choosing one of these perspectives, maybe societal, maybe one of the narrow perspectives, to choosing multiple perspectives. At one time, I think probably in that Miami meeting, there were as many as, I think, 6 perspectives that we were seriously considering and talking about. So you're welcome that we ended up with only 2. But kind of present in all of these debates was an awareness of the original and the ongoing intent of the reference case, which is to promote quality and comparability in analyses. And so in the end, as you've heard, we balanced all of these competing considerations with the recommendations that you have heard mentioned by Peter and David already. And these are the key ones that I'm focusing on here. One, that all studies should report a reference case analysis from a narrower healthcare sector perspective, and a second reference case analysis based on a societal perspective, as you've heard. And again, the goal in each of these cases is to provide some standardization of the methods and the components and approaches within these perspectives for the purpose of enhancing consistency across studies and comparability across these as well. We recommend that the healthcare sector reference case should lead to the calculation of a summary in the form of the traditional incremental cost effectiveness ratio expressed as costs per QALYs. But we also allowed that analysts may wish to report other metrics like net health benefit or net monetary benefit. We also suggested that analysts might consider a range of different thresholds, and perhaps that will be a topic of discussion in a few moments. With regard to the societal reference case analysis, as David has mentioned, we didn't go as far as to recommend a summary metric, especially we did not recommend that the societal reference case necessarily be summarized in terms of an ICER. But we did suggest that there should at least be, in the societal perspective, the completion of this impact inventory table, which is where it's possible to comprehensively enumerate the different health and non-health consequences of interventions. And we do encourage analysts to go as far as they are able to not just quantify these, but also to really measure and value them as well. And with that, let me turn to the impact inventory to say a little bit more about what that entails. This is a picture of what an impact inventory might look like, perhaps a little bit small for you to read, so let me step you through its components. But again, the main goal of the impact inventory is to ensure that all of the consequences, whether within or outside of the formal healthcare sector, are at least considered and recognized comprehensively. And we really see this as a tool for organizing, thinking about and collecting evidence and presenting various types of consequences. So just to say a few words about what the impact inventory comprises, we have columns in the table that show you the different sectors, the formal or informal healthcare sector and others. For each of those sectors, we allow for the organization of different types of impacts, and we give some categories here, but encourage the analyst to be as specific and detailed as they might. And then for each of those types of impacts that are listed in the table, the impact inventory provides a checklist to indicate which of those are included and which are excluded from the analysis. And that includes both which should be included from a particular perspective, but also recognition that in a particular that belong in a perspective may not be included for reasons of pragmatism, the kind of continuation of the rule of rescue that the first original panel enumerated. And then the organization of the table in the rows includes broad sections that distinguish, again, the formal healthcare sector, which includes outcomes and costs, some costs in the informal healthcare sector, and those in the non-healthcare sectors. So to look at how you might fill out one of these impact inventories, the checklist is there for the analyst to indicate whether a particular type of effect is included in their analysis from a particular perspective. And so type by type of these impacts, we have checklists for each of the different perspectives. Analysts, of course, are free if they choose a further perspective to add the column reflecting that. As we move from the formal to the informal, you see that some of these costs are in the societal perspective, but not the healthcare perspective, and the analyst may check when those are indeed included in the societal perspective reference case. And then moving on to some of the other sectors, productivity, consumption, social services. Again, the checklist is there to indicate that these are categories of outcomes that are in principle included in the broad societal perspective, but the analyst has the opportunity to indicate whether they have been accounted for, and if not, to provide the rationale for their exclusion. So with that, let me pass over to Lisa, who will have more to say about the impact inventory, as well as a broader set of issues around reporting. And you will again see the impact inventory when David presents the worked example. So over to Lisa, and thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Josh. I'm really delighted to be able to have the opportunity to present some of our recommendations around the reporting for cost-effectiveness analyses. Great. So the original panel emphasize the importance of appropriately reporting the results of cost-effectiveness analyses, and our updated recommendations continue to emphasize the importance of clear reporting for ensuring transparency, completeness, and comparability, as we've heard earlier from Josh and from David. So overall, the goal of the reporting recommendations is to help authors communicate meaningful information about the value of an intervention and where the impacts are greatest across sectors, target populations, and other areas. So the key updates to the 2016 recommendations include a structured abstract format, which I'll go through in the next few slides, the use of an impact inventory that we've been hearing about, and we'll see a worked example in the next section, and the reporting of intermediate and disaggregated outcomes, and I'll provide more details on the next few slides. So the updated recommendations include a structured abstract format to support all three objectives, providing transparency, ensuring completeness, and allowing for comparability across analyses. And while we hope that journals will adopt a structured format for cost-effectiveness analyses, we recognize that most journals do not currently have this requirement, and in this case recommend that analysts incorporate the elements from the structured format into the required format for a particular journal. In an earlier session today, we heard Andy Briggs made a comment that to some extent that the impact of these recommendations, especially for ensuring comparability across analyses, will depend in large part on how these recommendations are adopted by journals. So this slide shows an example of how to adapt the recommended reporting elements into a structured abstract format. So the elements that are underlined are those that are new to this set of recommendations or have received more attention in the updated guidelines. For example, the abstract should list whether reference case perspectives of the healthcare sector and societal were included as recommended, any other perspectives such as the payer perspective. The study design should include the modeling approach and other details as appropriate, and the updated definition of the set of results includes a measure of the robustness of the results to changes in parameter inputs, the model structure, and other sources of uncertainty. The reporting checklist has also been updated to include the impact inventory as well as some additional items related to modeling methods and results. So the updated reporting checklist reflects an additional emphasis on the design and scope, including analytic perspectives, as well as information on data sources, evidence synthesis methods, and a critique of the quality of the data, as well as identification of sources and methods for obtaining expert judgment if those were used in the analysis. While adherence to the reporting guidelines has improved since the original panel recommendations in many areas, the reporting for adjustments for health-related quality of life remains an important area of opportunity for improved reporting. In a recent study, more than a third of studies of cost-effectiveness analyses did not report the source that was used for quality adjustments to generate quality-adjusted life years in the analysis. So this is an area where there's clearly a lot of area for improvement. And it's important to note that the set of reference case results is defined to include not just the ICERs, but disaggregated costs and outcomes, and should include one or more measures of uncertainty. This increased emphasis on intermediate and disaggregated outcomes in the second panel recommendations relies on the understanding that cost-effectiveness analyses are rarely used explicitly in decision-making here in the U.S. context, as we know, and the reporting of intermediate outcomes such as number of cases, adverse events or complications, hospitalizations or deaths can often represent crucial information for decision-makers, especially when these outcomes are projected at a population level. The inclusion of intermediate outcomes can often help users who are less familiar with cost-effectiveness analysis to assess the quality and the accuracy of the modeling approach, and can improve their confidence in the modeling results. And as someone who's worked closely with CDC and other federal decision makers who consider cost-effectiveness evidence as one of their areas of evidence as part of the decision-making process, this can be a critical way for users to evaluate the validity of the model. And specifically when we're looking at disaggregated outcomes or intermediate outcomes, these can refer to both cost and quality-adjusted life years or other health outcomes. Users may be interested in different types of costs, such as medical care, out-of-pocket costs at the family level, startup costs for an intervention, ongoing costs, or they may be interested in the composition of quality-adjusted life years. As we heard in the valuation framework session this morning that there are obviously many factors that are considered outside of the cost effectiveness ratio, but there's lots of evidence generated within the cost effectiveness analysis framework that can be used to provide insights to informing some of those other considerations. For example, if we're looking at gains in qualities due to an intervention, these may be offset by side effects or adverse events, and the magnitude of these offsets can be important to decision makers. When we think about quality-adjusted life years, we have concluded that that the quality should continue to be the primary measure of outcome for cost-effectiveness analysis, but recognizing all the limitations of quality-adjusted life years, and within the reporting of those, to be able to include intermediate outcomes so that decision makers can assess what is driving the measurement of the qualities. Are we looking at hundreds of thousands of episodes of the flu or a handful of lives saved? And while these may result in similar amounts of quality-adjusted life years gained, that this could be important information for the decision maker in that context. We've heard earlier about the overall purpose of the impact inventory, and I'd just like to reemphasize the role of the impact inventory for reporting. First, we recommend that journals request and authors submit the impact inventory for all submitted analyses. And even for analyses that only include impacts in the healthcare sector, the reporting of the impact inventory can provide a clear and transparent method for the identification of effects in other sectors, even though they may not be included in this particular analysis. And we do recognize that due to space limitations for journals, that it will often not be feasible to include the impact inventory directly in the journal article, but this table could be a key part of the technical appendix to the analysis. And that we strongly recommend the submission of this as part of the peer review process to ensure transparency, communicate the bounds of the analysis, and to allow for comparisons across analyses. So the updated guidelines includes 12 specific recommendations that have been updated for the second panel. We'd like to highlight some key changes to these three recommendations. For recommendation number 2, the inclusion of the technical appendix to include the impact inventory to aid peer review. For recommendation number 3, the use of a structured abstract or the elements of a structured abstract format to improve comparability and transparency across analyses. And for the basic set of cost-effectiveness results to include intermediate health outcomes, disaggregated results, and a measure of robustness to reflect uncertainty, in the recognition that cost-effectiveness analysis in the U.S. context is used as an input to overall decision-making, and that these aspects of the analysis often have an important bearing on the decision and supports the best use of cost-effectiveness analysis in these contexts. So overall, the reporting recommendations continues to support the goal of providing transparency through the structured abstract, the checklist, the impact inventory technical appendix, as well as additional reporting of intermediate outcomes and disaggregated results. The updated guidelines continue to recommend that the summary report be accompanied by a technical appendix so that the analysis can be replicated if so desired. And these supplementary materials can range, depending on the complexity of the analysis, anywhere from 1 or more tables to a complete standalone technical manual, depending on the complexity of the analysis. And the report of the cost-effectiveness analysis should be designed to communicate all the important features of analysis, to highlight the aspects of the study, especially that are unusual or unexpected, to aid in interpretation. And recommendations for these updated reporting recommendations are for users and reviewers, that using these tools along with the impact inventory will allow for easier comparability across analyses, and that with more clear reporting of the analysis, this could potentially increase the likelihood that analysis will inform clinical or policy decisions. And we see that cost-effectiveness analysis, as we heard in the earlier morning session here, is starting to be used in some places here in the States, as well as in the development of clinical guidelines. So we expect to see this increasing over time. And our discussions in updating the reporting recommendations also identified some key areas for future clarification. Going forward, it will be important to continue to work to identify opportunities and methods, both for the sharing of models as well as the sharing of data sets included in the analyses, as well as opportunities for using technology to support new formats, including interactive displays and data visualization techniques for communicating cost-effectiveness results, which could further improve the interpretation of cost-effectiveness results. And so I'd like to close with a call to action to all journal editors, editorial board members, and authors that are creating and publishing cost-effectiveness analyses to consider how best to incorporate these reporting recommendations in order to achieve the goals of improving transparency and comparability across analyses. So thanks very much. I'll turn things over to David.
Thanks, Lisa. And before I start my work example, really, I really like to thank the second panels for their contributions. As an outsider participant to this process, I really witnesses a lot of deliberative and a lot of considerate debate, and then try to reaching out the consensus. So I think it's easy to criticize from outside, but we never acknowledge enough for the second panel's great contribution. So as an analyst perspective, I'm really grateful to have this great guideline. So I appreciate all of your voluntarily, effortlessly time and contributions to this chapter. Thank you. So the purpose of my presentation is really shows the worked example focused on evaluating the long-term cost effectiveness of treatment strategies for the individuals affected with alcohol use disorder. So this presentation is really tailored to highlight some of the new recommendations made by second panel. So the worked example is available at the appendix to more describe the detailed explanations. So let me start with the designing CEA. So the main objective of this work example is really to think about when we treat the patient with AUD, which treatment provides the most value when we consider from the lifetime horizon. So I'd like to evaluate lifetime cost effectiveness of AUD, alcohol use disorder treatment. And why this is important is really alcohol use disorder is the third leading underlying cause of preventable death in the United States, which causing a lot of adverse health consequences, but not only health outcomes, but also there's a huge spillover effect into outside of healthcare sector, such as the productivity and also criminal justice system. So as you heard a lot, so I utilized the full impact inventory to assess those impact on the healthcare sector, but also impact on the outside of healthcare sector. And I conducted this cost-effective analysis from two reference case perspective. One is from healthcare sector, the other one is from a societal perspective. So let me give you a brief introductions of alcohol use disorder. So alcohol use disorder, called AUD, is actually the medical conditions caused by the maladaptive patterns of alcohol consumption. So these are the range of distributions of, okay, here we go. So these are the spectrum of alcohol consumption. So a lot of people starting from the abstinence, lower risk drinking, and as they increase the consumption of alcohol, and then those increased consumption in alcohol influence their social and behavior, have an impact on the social role, and it gets risk drinking, harmful drinking, dependent drinking, and chronic dependence. The prevalence of alcohol use disorder is about like 8.5% in the United States, and then AUD is really comprised of harmful drinking, dependent drinking, and chronic dependence. And what is the effective treatment for the alcohol use disorder? There are some treatment options available. There are like mutual support groups such as Alcohol Anonymous. Also, there is a behavior intervention, which is basically the intensive counseling with the addiction specialist. But also, there is new drugs to help them to really going back to their normal life. So it's called the pharmacotherapy. So there is actually randomized controlled trial conducted to evaluate whether the pharmacotherapy is really better than just the behavior interventions. And in that original clinical trials, they evaluate the 9 interventions, the different combinations of behavior interventions, different types of medications. But to be simplified, basically what they're comparing is really pharmacotherapy, so giving medications to the AUD patients alongside with some very basic supportive care called the medical management. So you usually get to meet the nurse practitioners to discuss how you're doing with the adherence to the medication, benefit of the medication, things like that. And then really just the traditional types of intensive behavior counseling. So like 3-hour sessions, and then you meet with the addiction specialist. So they basically comparing this effectiveness of two interventions. And I like to utilize this data to evaluate the long-term cost effectiveness of this pharmacotherapy versus the behavior intervention. And in order to do that, I have to develop some lifetime state transition model, because the alcohol use disorder is a really chronic condition, so people just moving in and out of those addiction health state, and then also they intermittently seek whether they receive the treatment or not throughout their lifetime. So in order to model those dynamic behavior, so I like to build this lifetime state transition model. So let's assume that there are two patient cohort group. One patient cohort group received the medical management with medication, it's called the pharmacotherapy. The other group received the traditional intensive counseling. So that constitutes this AUD treatment group. And if those initial treatment is really unsuccessful, then they just living with alcohol use disorder. And if the initial treatment is successful to help them to get out of those addiction problem, they move into the LRD, which is called the low-risk drinking/abstinence health state. If you look at for those who stay in the AUD, throughout their lifetime, they'll still be in the addiction, so they'll be in the AUD health state. But also, they may seek the future treatment because they really want to get out of those addiction problem. If they seek the future treatments, depending on the result from the future treatment, if successful, they're moving into low-risk drinking health state. If failed again, then they're just going back to the alcohol use disorder. If they didn't seek the future treatment, there is a possibility to actually natural recovery. So without going through formal treatment, although it's very slim, with a very self-confident, self-motivated person can natural recovery from AUD. But as probably you all know, it's very unlikely. Most of them who didn't going through the formal treatments, going back to the alcohol use disorder. For those who are at this low-risk drinking, who has a successful initial treatment, they may stay in the low-risk drinking over the lifetime, but also there is a possibility of relapse going back to this addiction health state. So these are the simplified lifetime state transition model that I use. And the next thing is I'm going to discuss the impact inventory. And then you already heard about impact inventory, but as an analyst perspective, I use impact inventory first for the identification process, because really it helps me to ensure all consequences considered regularly and comprehensively. It really helped me to think about whether I identify this potential important impact or the missing out some important consequences. But after identification process, it really helped me to estimation process as well. Because once I identified important consequences, it helps me to identify whether I can quantify or value these important consequences and incorporate it into my cost-effective model. So I'm gonna go through some of the impact inventory specific to this worked example. So these are showing the impact inventory from the formal healthcare sector. So there is a list of important health outcomes, so longevity effect, health-related quality of life, how long they're going to live in the AUD health state throughout the lifetime model, this utility due to adverse event from treatment, also this utility of being incarcerated due to the alcohol-related crime, and then spillover health-related quality of life. So as you see here, as you see this checkbox, I included and quantified all of these important outcome except this spillover health-related quality of life. So I acknowledge that this is really important health outcomes that relevant to AUD, alcohol use disorder treatment. But the reason I was not be able to incorporate into model is that there is a lack of data. So it says this in the footnote, but basically, I identify one studies to say the caregiver for the AUD patients has a higher stress level compared to the caregiver for the non-AUD patients, but that study used a specific measure. So not just the preference-based genetic measures that we like to incorporate into our cost-effective analysis. So in the footnote, what I said is that, okay, I found these great articles, then I acknowledge that spillover effect important, but due to this limitation, I was not be able to incorporate into my main analysis. So that's what the footnote really says. If you're moving into the cost side, medical cost paid by the payers, out-of-pocket cost, future related medical cost, and future unrelated medical cost, I quantify everything and incorporate it into my cost-effective analysis. So if you look at the future related medical cost, I actually analyzed the medical expenditure panel survey, which is the US nationally representative data sets, to estimate how much the patient with AUD actually spending based on the age and then age group. And also, I incorporated those future unrelated medical costs, which is how much US general population usually spend using the same data set, the medical MAPS data. And if you are moving through the informal healthcare sector, I listed three things. The patient time cost is also important consequences of AUD treatment. Unpaid caregiver time is also important. Transportation cost. So I was able to incorporate patient time cost into my analysis, but unpaid caregiver time cost, there is absolutely no data available specific to this population, so I provided note. And moving to the non-healthcare sector, so I listed some of the important outcomes here. So productivity effect in the formal market in terms of earning, I measure it. So I utilize this average earnings per person based on the current population survey, which is a government survey data. And also, I utilize the labor force participation rates by this different health state from the earlier literatures to identify those probability of labor force participation depending on whether you suffer from AUD or that you're living with low-risk drinking. And also for future consumption unrelated to health is I utilize the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey, which provides it what the average American usually spend on the food, clothing, housing, and healthcare. But because we incorporated those the healthcare costs from a healthcare sector perspective, I estimated the non-healthcare expenditures. So that's the basis for the future consumption cost. And also, I was thinking about the other sectors that potentially important and relevant to this AUD treatment. So there are a lot of literature actually showing that the higher probability of committing crime among those AUD patients, also higher rates of having the motor vehicle accidents among the AUD patients. So I quantified it and incorporated it. So those are the impact inventory, and then I think panels mentioned that it's important not just to report these outcomes into just the one single aggregate measures, but also it's important to report in the disaggregate outcomes. So this is the lifetime projected outcomes and cost from a healthcare sector perspective. So I'm going to only provide it the behavior interventions and then the one of the 5 interventions in the pharmacotherapy arms, which is the medical management with the naltrexone, which eventually came out as the dominant strategy. So if you're looking at the health outcomes, this is the outputs from the model. So life year is slightly better for those who receive the pharmacotherapy. Quality of just life year also slightly better. And also the years living in the alcohol use disorder is lower for those who receive the pharmacotherapy. If you're looking at the cost, treatment cost is definitely higher for those who receive the medication due to this extra additional cost related to medication. Overall lifetime healthcare expenditure is slightly lower for those who receive this medical management with naltrexone. And if you're looking at the projected outcomes and costs from societal perspective, these are like consequences measured in years employed, years living in jail due to the alcohol use disorder-related crime, numbers of crime, numbers of alcohol-related motor vehicle accident. So because these are like spillover effect based on how long they live in the specific health state, AUD versus the low-risk drinking recovery state. So for those who receive the pharmacotherapy, has a little bit slightly higher durations of employment in the former market, and then the slightly less years in jail, reduce the number of crimes and associated motor vehicle accident. If you calculate this cost in terms of research utilizations, time cost is higher for those who receive behavior interventions because they need to spend more time with the addiction specialist. Productivity benefit is higher. Lifetime consumption is slightly higher for those who receive the pharmacotherapy due to the extended life year, but also reduced in terms of legal criminal justice system cost. So if you plot this in the traditional cost effectiveness plane, so these are like the y-axis representing the incremental, the health benefit, and then the x-axis representing the incremental cost. So basically, among those, the all pharmaceutical intervention is cost saving compared to the behavior interventions. And among those 4 pharmacotherapy, medical management with the naltrexone is also the dominant strategy, which basically means that better outcomes with a less cost. It has the same result from the societal perspective. So basically, pharmacotherapy is really cost-saving intervention, even compared to the behavior intervention. So if you're thinking about comparing this pharmacotherapy to the no treatment option, it's going to provide it better bang for the buck for the pharmacotherapy. And then the important thing is really the second panel has put a lot of importance on the uncertainty analysis. We know that the pharmacotherapy is a cost saving based on the expected value, but the interesting question is that among those pharmacotherapy interventions, there is one intervention who only received the naltrexone only, which is called the monotherapy. The other intervention received the naltrexone and a comprothate, both FDA-approved treatment for AUD, which is combination therapy. Interesting finding from the clinical trial is that really combination therapy associated with a higher treatment cost, basically they received the 2 drugs same time. It turned out to be more effective at the end of 16 weeks of treatment from those clinical trials, but after 1 year follow-up, it associated with a higher rates of relapse. So after incorporating all of these, on average, the monotherapy with the naltrexone is really better than the combination therapy, but really I like to explore this, how these, especially the rate of relapse, play around for the final result. And the second panel highlight that in order to address those uncertainty, analysts should consider probabilistic sensitivity analysis, which parameterize every information in your model and just do the basically Monte Carlo simulations to drive joint distributions of a cost and effect over lifetime, and the plot cost effectiveness acceptability curve based on different willingness to pay. But the downside of this, the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, that is really there is no ways to do the traditional one-way deterministic sensitivity analysis. People sometimes really interested in what if we change only one parameter at a time, how those really influence my result. So we are thinking about this, combining this deterministic sensitivity analysis alongside with the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, and came out with this conditional probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So these are the traditional cost effectiveness acceptability curve, but each at the $100,000 willingness to pay threshold. So the difference is that here we're going to looking at the 2 different interventions, naltrexone versus the combination therapy of naltrexone and a comprothate. Y-axis is just traditionally showing the probability of being the most cost-effective, or in my cases, because everything is cost-saving, I put it as provided the largest net monetary benefit. But if you're looking at this y-axis, instead of a willingness to pay threshold, I put the 1 year rate of relapse after the initial treatment for the combination therapy. So we keep the nature of the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, providing that which intervention has a probability of being the largest net monetary benefit, but also you can see the impact of deterministic one-by-one changes. So if the combination therapy has a lower than about 0.13 rate of relapse after 1 year, then this combination therapy actually becomes the most cost-effective or provide the largest net monetary benefit interventions. But the question is how likely that to happen. So I plot this, I overlap with the distributions of 1 year relapse rate of the combination therapy based on the actual clinical trial data. So I generated these distributions to see that in a likelihood of the 1 year relapse rate, what would be the probable, what intervention is the most cost-effective or provide the largest the net monetary benefits. So if you're considering those facts together, interpretation of this graph is that in the reasonable way, in the reasonable range of those relapse rate of combination therapy, still naltrexone is really dominant strategy among the all strategy we consider. So I ended up with this last slide. So I think the one key takeaway really, and then the second panel really put emphasis on it, is really think about considering broader consequences. A lot of studies due to like pragmatism or decision-making perspective conducted from a healthcare sector perspective. But from my work example, I added patient time cost, productivity effect, consumption cost, legal cost, and motor vehicle cost. So it's kind of like thinking about more broader consequences and what really important to capture when we're trying to measure the true value of treatment for the alcohol use disorder. But challenge is that I capture everything? Definitely not. There are a lot of other things like transportation cost, caregiver time cost. If you think it's relevant, you can consider housing, education, social services, and environment, which comprise the overall societal perspective. So this work example is not just showing that this is the way to do it, but one way to do it. But I think it's important to capture, think about broader consequences of interventions you're going to evaluate. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all, my fellow panel. I think somehow this goes up. Somebody is in charge of that back there, I hope, and we can sit behind it as soon as it happens. So, yeah, it magically happens somehow. We have time for questions. So, Carl, I'm not surprised to see you here. Let's tell us who you are and your affiliation, please. Yeah.
Okay,
please.
so absolutely an incredible task, guys. Thank you so much. I think the reference case originally had an enormous impact, not just on the field, but on policy, certainly in the UK and NICE, and you've maintained those principles in this second edition, which is really important. That principle that it is a reference point. It is not a prison of orthodoxy. It's a reference point for comparability, and it's excellent that's been preserved. I've got two questions. The first one is I completely agree with what David said about let's not double count. That's really, really important. And I guess it poses a question for me around production. See, for me, the qualities that we might estimate to be gained do require some consumption, at least some minimal level of consumption to actually deliver them. That must be the case, irrespective of what we think the descriptive system looked like or how those health states are valued, just in the same way as those quality gains will inevitably require future unrelated healthcare costs. They're part of the cost. So I'm a little bit concerned that we've moved to gross rather than net production. But my second question's this, which is really about opportunity costs of the additional healthcare costs associated with the intervention that we're evaluating. Now, the nature, the scale and the value of those opportunity costs will differ depending on the healthcare system. But irrespective of whether it's a private insurance system or whether it's like the UK with collective funding and a budget, inevitably some of those opportunity costs will fall on health, some of them will fall on production in the wider economy, some of them will fall on consumption effects for patients and their carers. And without assessing that, I think we've got three problems. Number one is we can't really inform policymakers about the key question: do the benefits exceed the scale and value of what else we could have done with that healthcare system resource? We can't answer that question for them. We simply present them with a summary, and I think it reduces our impact. Secondly, the production and consumption effects are not the same as healthcare costs. They're not the same thing. Certainly, empirically in the UK, the evidence seems to suggest that the ratio is about 3 to 1, or maybe even 4 to 1, that an NHS pound is worth 3 or 4 times as much as a private pound. Now, whether or not it's 3 to 1, 4 to 1, or 1 to 1 in some healthcare systems, that's an empirical question, and getting that empirical question right really matters if we put in all the dollars in the numerator. The third one is, I think, that we really do need to account for the production losses associated with those health opportunity costs. So again, just talking about the UK, because we have a bit of evidence there, £13,000 gets you one QALY. It also gets you £12,000 of net production effects in the wider economy, and we also reduced health inequality. Richard's there has been doing some work on that. And so I'm going to sum up now, but my real concern is that without that, we do run a real danger that it can look like we've got something that improves health outcomes and saves costs overall for the healthcare system and society. But in reality, if we understood the opportunity costs and how they play out, it could have in fact reduced health outcomes overall. It could have increased healthcare system costs and increased societal costs as well. So, unless we nail the opportunity costs, we still run some very big risks here.
Question. I don't know if this is working or not. So I want to really substantively answer your question, but I have to start by, no, I'll try to substantively answer it and then I'll tell a little story, okay? I think the issues that you raise are serious ones, and I think that we've struggled a lot in understanding what is incorporated in quality of life measures. And I think, over the past 15 years or 20 years, whatever, since the last report, there's more and more evidence that some of the effects that one could imagine being reflected in those things are not consistently reflected in them by most people. And I think we see that through some experimental studies that vary the way in which questions are answered and others. I think it's true about productivity. I think it's probably true about consumption to some extent. The upshot is this is a very imperfect science, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second issue about opportunity cost, I think Mark Sculfer really emphasized that a lot in his comments, and I think that was a really good way for a lot of us from the US to think about things. I think that we think about things less in budgets. We think about them more from a theoretical perspective where resources are mutable between purposes, and so this concern is less of a real one, but in practice, I recognize that it is. My question for all these things comes down to how much can we do about it, and how much can we do about it methodologically, and how much does it matter in terms of changing the results that we see? And so this is where I sort of come back to a story, which is, I think a few people here at least have heard me describe this before. I'm sitting down across from Ken Arrow at a dinner in Stanford a number of years ago, and sheepishly, explaining to him what I did, and explain that part of what I did was cost effectiveness analysis, and he knew that he'd proven that didn't really mean anything. And because of all the distributional problems and the Arrow impossibility theorem. And anyway, he's a lovely man, and proceeded to tell me this story about how he became an economist because he was recruited by, he was, I guess, drafted by the US military to go, in World War II, and was assigned to a group of people who were supposed to predict the weather for D-Day, basically to decide when to launch the invasion. And he thought the smartest people were the economists, so he decided that he wanted to be an economist. But he told me this story in the end saying, all this stuff is imperfect, but in the end, you just sometimes have to predict the weather. And I think the point about all of this is that, and I think this came through in the theoretical chapter again and again and again, there are lots of holes in our ability to do this exactly right. And so what we need to do is understand the issues, try to do our very best to quantify them and delineate them. And the one thing I will just say is that I hope when people look at the impact inventory, it's not just a checklist, but a reminder that somewhere you need to have put numbers on these things to the best of your ability, and that you don't think that whether you calculate an ICER or not, what matters is you understand how your decision is going to change based on the assumptions that you made. It's ultimately a reminder to do a really careful, as quantitative as you can, sensitivity analysis. And they're all going to be imperfect. They're all going to have variabilities that matter a lot or matter a little. Our goal is to understand these things. And so that's kind of where I come down on it. I hope that's useful.
Okay, other questions, thoughts? You want to answer?
Not badly, no.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. On the way. Yeah, go to the mic if you would and tell us who you are.
Thank you. So Richard Cookson, University of York, one of Carl's colleagues. Who am I facing? You guys. I'll say one very nice thing and one more provocative thing, if I may. So the nice thing is great, fantastic, and I really hope that journal editors gradually take this on board, because I think, the Drummond checklist is quite old now, so we need a better checklist, and we've got two. You've proposed two very useful checklists. So that's the positive thing, and they may well be the right things, the right items in the checklist. My question, my provocation is whether a US panel has the authority to speak for the whole international community in terms of journal editors. Don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are American and so on, but it is a country which has actually banned the use of cost effectiveness the right one to be telling the world how to do it? That's my question.
I'll just start by saying, we do have a couple of paragraphs in the introduction chapter. We do have a couple of paragraphs in the introductory chapter about the audience and this issue of international versus U.S. And as I mentioned, we recognize this is a U.S.-focused effort. Most of the authors are U.S.-based. The funding came from the U.S., and we recognize its impact likely will be largest in the U.S. We did deliberately have 3 non-U.S. members, Murray Cron and David Feeney from Canada, and Mark Sculfer from the UK. We learned an enormous amount from them. Their influence shaped some of the recommendations. And we also thought deliberately that we hope this book would have influence, resonance overseas, other countries. Ultimately, whether it does or not is up to people in those countries, of course. And, ultimately, any of the recommendations and whether they have impact is going to depend on whether people find them helpful. So we hope they do, and we can reconvene here maybe in a couple of years and see if they do.
So that is a very fair point, and I'm happy to qualify my call to action. And I would say that, of course, we're not making that call for international journals, but partly what we were thinking about in terms of those recommendations is also clinical journals, where a lot of cost-effectiveness analysis, economic evaluations are published, and there is extremely variable review. And I think that's an opportunity where, if we're looking at decisions that are being made in the U.S. context, that the adoption of these reporting recommendations could really make major improvements, especially in the clinical journals.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that since QALYs were banned by the Quarries Enabling legislation, which is, of course, part of the Affordable Care Act, that if the Trump administration proceeds in rescinding the Affordable Care Act, then we're back in business again.
I mean, that's unusual for David to be glass half full, but it's a peculiar sort of glass that he's describing in any case. Just to kind of elaborate on this point about reporting, I mean, my read on the reporting recommendations, as Lisa described them very nicely, is that they have to do a lot more with transparency of methods and assumptions than they do with the kind of idiosyncrasies of cost-effectiveness analysis from a U.S. perspective. And I hope that people will take that from them, including journal editors.
Next comment. Eric Nauenberg, I'm from north of the border in Toronto. Just about the same time that you've released your standards, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health has just released its new updated standards for cost effectiveness analysis. One of the areas that you didn't touch about was the discount rate in your comments today. CADIS has reduced their standards from 5% to 1.5% as a reference case, citing to some extent, if you look at the debate about it, that historically there have been very low interest rates over the last number of years, and that has an impact, should have an impact on discount rates, and that those historically low rates of borrowing in the financial markets it was some of the impetus behind their decision to lower down to 1.5%. I was wondering that you've kept your reference case the same as it was in 1995 at 3%. I'm wondering if you wanted to discuss a little bit about the differential between what CADIS has determined and what you've decided to release just about the same time, and what relationship in your... Oh, okay. The relationship between financial markets and historically low interest rates and what ought to be the reference case with regard to discount rates in healthcare.
I honestly, despite being an economist, don't feel super well qualified to answer that. I mean, I guess I assume that what recommendations you came were based on changes in real interest rates rather than changes in nominal interest rates. And it's not clear to me, it's very clear to me that real interest rates have fallen a lot globally just because inflation has fallen because of changes in monetary policy. But it's not completely clear to me that real returns in stock markets have necessarily changed so much. What I am familiar with a little bit is the literature on returns to investments in education. And we know that they've fallen quite a lot in developed countries recently, although not necessarily in developing countries. So as I said, I don't know a lot about the issue. I'm not familiar with the discussion you had, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Just add, the author of that chapter, Anne Basu, unfortunately is not here with us to elaborate. We do say in the chapter that this should be revisited with more information and research, for one. Two, we do have a paper coming called Future Directions in Cost Effectiveness Analysis, which contains a lot of material that didn't make it into the book, but is sort of a forward-looking paper. It's sort of the last chapter of the panel, if you will, which we'll have some more to say, because I know we've heard from others about discount rates, and so stay tuned on that chapter. On that paper, rather.
So I think discounting, I'm not arguing with the theoretical background, but what the chapter basically saying is that to maintain comparability with the first panel, they recommend 3% discount rate for both cost and effect. Since then, there are some debates on whether we should maintain same discount rates for the cost and health effect, also what rate we should apply for as you mentioned, like we should do the lower the 1%, 1.5%, considering the economic conditions going on. But I think what panels ended up is really that those are like empirical questions and ongoing really studies. So they recommended 3% to maintain comparability, but also in the case that if you have evidence that shows the discount rate is not really 3%, then you should conduct the sensitivity analysis to use those different discount rates. So reference case analysis really, as I think all of this panel mentioned, is to maintain comparability across different studies so that the value estimate you're going to use from those studies can be comparable. So I think that's the base for the reference case.
Jeffrey.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Hotch from the University of California at Davis. I wanted to thank the panel for their work. Very interesting. It occurred to me there might be a segment of the population who are interested in using the results, so going beyond the what to the so what. And in some cases, that might involve comparing the results to some sort of threshold. And I wondered if the panel had any thoughts about how we should think about this threshold. I've heard some people say with British accents that cost is foregone health. And they think about it, as David was talking about previously, as opportunity cost. And I've heard other people talk about thresholds that we could estimate, maybe even empirically, that would give us that magical willingness to pay. Do you feel like we should just be happy making the analysis, or do you feel we have a higher calling to help people use it? And if we help them use it, how should we think about the threshold?
So let me just start, and I'll hand it over by saying the second panel follows the first panel's lead in not endorsing any specific threshold. We do have a discussion of thresholds, what they mean, how to define them, how to think about them. Written, by the way, by, in part, Mark Sculfer, thinking about opportunity costs in the UK's experience, and Anirban Basu, and thinking about sort of US private market and some of the willingness to pay literature. Pages 23 to 25 of the panel book, I happen to know because it comes up a lot, and I'm pointing people to those pages. So these debates go on right after this session. By the way, we're having a whole session here on cost-effectiveness thresholds that will once again get into that. So I guess I just want to point out there is certainly discussion about thresholds, how to think about them, different ways to think about them, some of the empirical evidence that's now coming forward. Anybody else?
I mean, I would just add, somewhat related to the question, but another nuance and an important discussion that I think has arisen, and it's one of the things that we address a little bit in the Future Directions chapter forthcoming, is this question about how cost-effectiveness criteria intersect with other constraints around affordability. And of course, you all are aware of the very high-profile examples recently of, for example, drugs for hepatitis C virus infection, where this conflict or discrepancy between cost-effectiveness and affordability really come to the fore. I know Carl has thought about this and has recommendations for how to systematically account for that. But I think it does, in a way, collide with the question of thresholds and become increasingly important for those who want to translate information on cost effectiveness into actionable policy in light of some of the other realities and the constraints. And so I think there is a lot of work to be done in that sphere in terms of what analysts can do to provide useful information, but also guidance on how to reconcile some of these competing criteria. It's not something that we said much about in the panel, but that's one of the issues that we hope that some of the discussions that we did grapple with will continue to prompt debate and progress in these sort of related and difficult aspects.
Anybody else on that?
No, I mean, just quick comment. It's just obviously sensitivity analysis remains a really important component of this, and in some of the more newly popular approaches like net health benefits, your assumption about the valuation of the threshold becomes an element of the calculation with which it's extremely easy to incorporate that uncertainty into your evaluation of decisional uncertainty and value and so on. So there are some added nuances of that decision that then are reflected in some of these new methods, I think, in a very nice way.
So we have a few more minutes. There's no other questions that I see. So perhaps we could end, and I did not tell the panel we'll do this, but I'll ask them if they choose to answer just some high-level reflections as we close on the second panel. And I'll start and give you a little chance to think about it. And I just say, you know, one approaches an effort like this with certainly a degree of humility. And one of the takeaways for me, and I think for the panel, is a lot of the value here is in the deliberations and the discussion and in reflecting those deliberations in the book rather than coming up with specific answers. Maybe that's obvious, but perhaps in retrospect it is, and during the process it became clear. I think a lot of what's in the book is a call for clarity where we haven't had clarity in the past. Even though people say they do the societal perspective, there's been a tremendous amount of variation. Certainly there's a lot of discussion about theoretical foundations and double counting and use of cost-effectiveness analysis and such. But this is certainly a journey. This is a step in a journey. ISPOR, we have Lou Garrison and Dick Wilkie here, and myself too, working on this task force on value. Which is reflecting on the panel and already taking, next steps. All of us certainly will be thinking about this for our own context. So, I think the best way to think about this is it's a I hope a contribution to a long-time journey to try to do better and get more health for our spending.
Yeah, I do feel like this is a little bit like the end of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, where I'm supposed to say something amusing, but I'm not going to do that. I will add and I guess reiterate Peter's comment that participating in this has been a great privilege for me and incredibly humbling in a couple of ways. One is to look back and to really carefully reread the original panel's report and recognize how much wisdom was contained in that, and to really appreciate the process of wrestling with some of the very thorny issues 20 years ago in such a thoughtful way. And if you look at how far we've gotten over the last 20 years, in some respects, the biggest advance has been the accumulation of experience of trying to apply the guidance that came from the original panel at a time when there just was a relatively limited amount of experience. But I guess the other humbling aspect is that there are so many of the controversies that the original panel wrestled with that persist to this date, and that we sort of wrestled freshly with. But honestly, in some cases, I'm not sure that we, as a field over the last 20 years, have advanced that far, or that we, as the second panel, really moved the needle very far. So I think that is quite humbling for me to both kind of acknowledge the path-breaking work of the original panel, to look at the last 20 years of experience in applying that, and to recognize that a lot of these persistently difficult issues really continue to await resolution. And so we do hope that the contributions of the second panel are to bring some of these to light again, or to kind of renew the light on these, and that it does prompt in the field through the next wave of experience in applying these advances, where there were issues that we grappled with and were unable to resolve. We look to you all as the practitioners and the users to kind of help pave the way for that.
And so I'll just echo what an incredible experience it was to be a part of the process, and that despite, as Peter described it, our wrestling over the last many years, that when reflecting on the decisions and recommendations of the first panel, that after years of discussion through this process, we came to the same decisions. And that I think that just highlights how much work there still has to be done in the field. And with our future directions chapter, I know what we talked about here are recommendations. We really didn't go into the much longer list of questions that need to be addressed, very soon and in depth. And just to highlight a couple of the areas that we didn't talk about today, include around the measurement of health, where we came to the conclusion that quality adjusted life years would remain the recommended outcome of interest. And there's been much discussion here at this conference about the limitations of qualities, but really there's nothing better to use. But also highlighting, the work that needs to be done in that area, thinking about, what dimensions need to be included beyond health when these considerations. So thinking about special populations, we still don't have good ways to measure child health, thinking about spillover effects on family members and measuring and being able to incorporate those that came up in the worked example. I think are a couple examples. The question around thresholds, especially for a U.S. context where we don't have a defined budget or a single decision maker, is an important area. So I think there are a number of issues, and the list is very long in our future directions chapter, and some of which we still couldn't even include there. So I think we'll have to have another session there as well. So I'll sit there.
Great. So I agree with all the great comments. I think for me, one of the things that was really striking was how, when we came in, how much we all had different perspectives on things that we often didn't appreciate. Not even just different disciplinary training, but differences that came from different experiences using it in different countries and in different purposes. And I think one striking thing for me is that we managed to keep working together despite what were often these really, really deep differences. And, economists have, a great tradition of being honest and direct with each other, but not always a great tradition of following that up and actually working together to solve the problem. And I just want to say that we didn't always solve the problem, but I think we worked really hard to. And I do think there's a great lesson in the value of trying to stick with your colleagues and understand their perspectives, because I know I learned a ton from being in the panel, and it's clear the field still has a ton more to learn too, so it needs that sort of openness to different perspectives.
So I think I ended up with the answering questions on analyst burden because I'm an analyst to carry out those recommendations. So if I provide a short answer, yes, definitely there are a lot more burden from analyst side. But I think I looked this additional analyst burden through the lens of why we're doing cost-effective analysis and step back from it. So the reason we are doing cost-effective analysis is really to quantify the additional health benefits can be justified with the additional cost. So that's all the concept. So if you're looking from this additional burden, thinking about this as an additional cost and whether this additional burden produced the important additional benefits to the society so that we can improve this methodology, we can improve those quality of cost-effective analysis so that decision makers really put more trust on the information that we produced, so that this information can be used for actual decision making. I think the benefits of this additional burden outweighs the actual cost to the analyst, but this is just based on my experience and then just my take. So.
Okay. So with that, please join me in thanking the panel. Thanks to all of you for coming, and we are now adjourned. Thanks, guys. Thank you.